Hi, thanks for having me. I'm going to start playing Is This Technology Going to Work game, but it probably will. So can everybody see my screen? And yes. All right, can someone give me a thumbs up if it looks like a slideshow should look? Thank you. All right. Again, thanks for having me. My name is Jenna, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about the role that play plays in my life as a teacher, as an artist, as a designer, and show you some work that I've done with my students, with scientists, with elephants, as it turns out. And then I hope we can have some conversations about how play shows up in whatever work that you're doing. So I first want to start, I get this question a lot, which is, how do I make a playful environment? And unfortunately, I don't have a top 10 list of how to make a really playful classroom, but I think the best advice I have is that I prioritize it. It's incredibly important to me that my students at least know that they're allowed to play and that they can, and I work, I think, pretty directly to try to make an environment that encourages that. And that is because it's important to me just as much as any of the rest of the content that I'm doing. And, I do have some privilege as a teaching higher ed where I'm sort of making my own curriculum. But I do think in any classroom anywhere, it's important that you as a teacher prioritize the kind of environment that you want to see. So I think one of the best projects to demonstrate my philosophy with teaching in play is this one that we called Elephantoidis. So this is a project that was made in a class I teach called Epic Fail. That's a real college class. I somehow got them to let me call it that. And it's a course about learning through making, learning through playing, learning through failure. And believe it or not, that's pretty hard for artists and designers to do. It's a population that's incredibly attached to being perfect for a lot of reasons. And so to help them be in an environment where they can create and learn through the kind of mistakes that they make is what I'm trying to do. And so as over the years that I've taught this class, I started to do something that I didn't know how to do either, so that I could model for my students, how do I keep learning as a professor? And so this project came my way a few years back. I was contacted by the National Zoo, and literally what they said to me was, do you think you and your students could design a toy to help elephants make friends? And I was like, take my money. I would like to try at least. So it was the best proposal I've ever gotten, other than my marriage proposal. And we decided to try to do it. And the best thing about working with art students is that it doesn't often occur to us that we can't do something. So in 15 weeks, we built an 800-pound toy for elephants at the National Zoo. So I thought I'd show you how we did it. So we started by coming up with prototypes, and we only had 15 weeks. And as those of you who teach semesters know, that really means 13 weeks because the first week and the last week are shot. And so we had to come in with some constraints. And so we knew, I knew from talking to the zoologists and the animal behaviorists at the zoo that elephants love that toy that's like a weeble wobble toy. It's like a plastic thing that has sand in the bottom, and you smack it and then it comes back up and gets you. The elephants apparently laugh, and they break it every time they play with it because elephants are very heavy and those toys are meant for children. But they think it's really hilarious. And I don't know why they think it's so funny, but we thought maybe if you were an elephant in the woods and you knocked down a tree and it came back up, that'd probably be pretty funny. So we knew that we wanted to design a toy that did that. And there's a lot of engineering involved in that, and none of us are engineers. So we had to just keep trying and keep building it until we figured it out. And we did it by making it work on a very small scale, and then crossed our fingers that it would work when we made it huge. And luckily it did. Spoiler alert. So anyway, this is how we made it. We used a lamination process with CNC routing. This is many, many, many layers of very cheap plywood because I didn't think this was going to work. So I just got whatever wood companies would donate or were going to throw out because I just wanted to see if we could build it first. So we stacked all this wood and glued it together and made all these different bolts. And this, we had to test it out, of course. So this is for scale, this student's about 5'4", fitting inside the bottom of the weeble wobble part of the toy. And she thought it was very fun. So we thought that's a good sign. And then the top part of the toy, so we decided to make this like a, like a kid's toy with a cone and stacking tires on it. We made the cone top part out of steel. So one of the things that they told us at the zoo is there's no such thing as elephant proof. There's only elephant resistant. So we just had to try to think of materials that could maybe withstand some elephantness. And then also we thought to make it modular so that if a part wore off, they could replace it. So we knew that eventually they would kill the bottom part of the wood, but the steel should last a long time. So that's why we built it that way. So we did this with plasma cutting. So it was the same thing that we had done in prototyping with laser cutting and like cardboard. And then we just scaled up the machine in the process. And this is the students doing all of the work of grinding and welding and putting it all together. And then an interesting thing for us in terms of scientific research was, all of the materials that we made had to be okay for an elephant to put in their mouth, because just like toddlers, they want to touch and eat everything. So everything had to be safe. So we had to find an approved kind of sealant that would make this be able to last outside, but obviously not hurt the elephants. And then you notice that it really, you can see the difference. That's before sealant and that's after sealant, really changing the patina of the steel into a beautiful result. Then we ended up deciding to build it at the zoo because we knew from our artist calculations that it was going to be heavier than we could transport in a truck, in our pickup trucks, So we transported it in half. I took half of it in my Honda Element, and then a friend of mine brought the rest of it in his pickup truck. We went to the zoo and we filled the bottom with 300 pounds of sand. So that was about, in our calculations, what we thought would scale up to work to make it wobbly. Luckily, the zoo has a ton of sand because elephants do a lot of stuff in sand. And so we put that in the bottom and then used a forklift to put the cone on top. The cone is like 200 pounds of steel. So we had to put that on and bolt it together. It was what we knew also about elephants is that they are experts at sensing structural weaknesses. That's something that they're very good at in the wild, and that's part of how they survive. So we knew that they would know exactly how this toy was put together, and we had to make sure they couldn't take it apart because obviously it wouldn't be safe for them to do it. But elephants love bolts and screws. They want to undo them. So maybe next project we build it based on that. And so then we brought it on the last day of class, last day of class ever. We got to bring the toy to the elephants at the zoo. And, the big test, this is of course a class called Epic Fail, was like, are they going to like it? I mean, those of you who've ever brought a toy to a kid and have them not care less about it, or especially not just a kid, but a cat or a dog, it's hard to get an animal to like a toy. So we were just unsure of what would happen, but they went right to it. And then again, the premise of trying to get them to socialize, they came to it as a group, which was really fascinating to see. And inside of the cone, we put a little gong. So when you move it, it makes a really nice swishing sound, which we also know that elephants like. And they, of course, just as the zookeeper said they would, they went right to the bolts to see if they could take it apart, which they couldn't because we were a step ahead of the elephants, but they tried. They tried to take it apart right away, and they tried to eat the wood. Zooming ahead to way later, this lasted for almost 2 years. And the way that they did finally destroy it was they just kept eating and eating and eating the wood, and eventually ate through the plywood. And then all of the sand came out. So we think it must have been trying to bust a piñata for 2 years, and then they finally did it. So hopefully that brought them some joy as well. And then this video is always a little bit tricky, but we're gonna hope it works. Okay. Oops, let me go back one. This is them. They knocked it over and they got it stuck, and then they had to work together to try to get it back out. It took them 40 minutes. So the elephants really taught us a lot that day about teamwork and perseverance and patience. It was really a magical thing to watch them play with our toy. And It was exactly what that class is all about, which is trying something that nobody thinks you should be able to do. And it's would have been fine if it didn't work, but it did. And I'm very proud of all the students for their work in that. So another, it's like, shifting gears, another way that I bring play in a lot to the classroom environment, like how do I build that environment of play, of risk, of trying to break away from perfection? Well, I tend to make a lot of things puzzles or things that can be solved. Students either like they equally love or hate them, so I find it puts them on a good playing field. This particular puzzle is one of the first puzzles that I made, and actually made it in Philly at the Hacktory that used to be right near the University City Science Center. And that's where it was like a residency there. And that's where I made this first kind of interactive puzzle piece. And this is a little video of like how it works. So it's tiles from an Islamic patterning system. It's a tenfold symmetry system, and so it's very difficult to build with it actually, because our brain isn't really used to that kind of symmetry and the way that it folds. And I had thought that this would be a great kind of building tool for my students, who often as artists, it's sort of like their hands understand math, but their brains were not taught to understand it the way that their hands do. So they're able to do these really complex algorithms essentially with these tiles without even really realizing it, but they're exceptionally good at it, is what I find from watching it, because they understand it on a different level. And that's actually the history of these tiles is sort of the same. This patterning system was created hundreds of years before the math was discovered. So this was done through intuition and through practice and through culture and through folklore, which is also a very important part about play, is looking to, your community. It's like, you play at home. And sometimes I think that's why it doesn't get taken as seriously as it should, is that it's, it's democratized. So another history of puzzles is back in the day when they were like when blacksmiths were learning how to make horseshoes and things like that. One of the ways that they would get trained is that they had to make a lot of, they had to do a lot of bending of steel and metals and things like that. So they would have all of these different shapes, and that's how Tavern Puzzles started. Those are those ones that are like all the little metal things and the chains, and you have to get the circle out or whatever. And it comes from that history of like there just being a lot of stuff left over in the studio, and then how do we make it into something and maybe make some money off of it. It's a very entrepreneurial idea. So I think about that a lot when I'm introducing a new concept in class. So one of the things that I teach is digital fabrication and prototyping. And so a lot of times I'm working with students that aren't aware of like how to work three-dimensionally digitally. Their spatial awareness might be somewhat limited. They might be used to just sort of 2D thinking. So I start with this idea of whenever introducing something abstract that I like to go concrete to abstract. So can you touch it with your hands first and then do a rendition of it on the computer? So I start with giving them a bunch of wooden blocks, and they build these what are called polyhedral puzzles. They're 9x9 cube puzzles. They build it in real life out of wood. And then we go into Tinkercad, which is a great entry-level design software that I'm sure many of you are using with your students. If not, it's free and it's great. And then I have them build those pieces in the computer, and then they print them out and we mix them around with the wooden tools and try to make something beautiful out of it. But it's a great way for them to start thinking about another concept in building, which is like polyhedral dissection. And so I'm sneaking in the math a little bit. And again, it's math that they're very good at doing practically, but if you try to make it all numeric, they would maybe not be as inclined to be interested in it, but their hands are certainly interested in it. And so this has led to other projects. These are some student projects that I thought were interesting that came out of learning to use 3D software and printing through a puzzle project. This is a puzzle box that a student named McKenna Sanderson made. What I love about this is that it all started with plastic and some wood, and then she did all of this finishing so that you really can't tell what the materials are. Even when you're touching it, it's everything is so finished that it's really difficult to know what it is. And it just turned out really beautifully, and it's a very, very difficult puzzle to solve, actually. This is another puzzle that I love that this ended up being part of the student's thesis project, Eric Chen, that these puzzles are, this is a bowl of like a fishball soup. And so he's talking about his culture, and he was able to share with us what this meant to his family. And this puzzle is really cool. There's like a bowl of water and these like 3D printed fish cubes, and you have to get the one fishball like under the bridge, but you can't touch it. And the way that you solve it, spoiler alert, is that you blow on it with air and then it goes through. And then this is a like 100-year egg puzzle that he made. And all of this is made out of, it's just PLA. It's just plastic that he has finished with sanding and painting and love. This is another puzzle that like came out of that idea for learning about like dissections and how you can do that like serial plane work. And this is made from laser cutting and PLA plastic. This is also a very difficult puzzle, and it's very ginger as well. It's a very tender puzzle. I also, as most of you know, we taught all online last year. And so it was, for me as somebody who, I do a lot of socializing in class to try to get them comfortable. It was very difficult to recreate that online because it's so easy to just, sort of be in a one-on-one conversation with your screen. So one of the things I developed for the first day of class was an online escape room. And it does a couple of things. Of course, it lets me be, like I get to be the dorky one, and then that makes them comfortable to be dorky as well. So before class started, I sent out a survey and I found out a lot of information about my students, and I hid clues about them in the syllabus. And then, so these puzzles are some about the students and some about the class. So here's an example of one of the puzzles that they eventually find if they click on the right stuff, where they have these strings and they're supposed to end up connecting them with the dots. And when they do that, they get a clue, and then that takes you to the next puzzle. So a natural offshoot also of, I'm always interested in this sort of intersections of art and design and science and technology and math, and because that's just sort of what inspires me to want to make art and to want to teach. I ended up having this great opportunity to work at Johns Hopkins at the Hopkins Extreme Materials Institute. That's what HEMI stands for. So it's not extreme materials like everything's made out of Mountain Dew. It's regular materials under extreme conditions, which actually is so fascinating to me as somebody who, I consider myself someone who studies failure, but a failure in the educational sense, I guess. But they're studying failure at a very like specific molecular level and making new materials to try to, make things that protect you, like Kevlar and helmets and things like that. But I ended up having a residency there where I was an artist in residence, and that this very like privilege to just be able to wander around and look at people's work and then make art about it, which is just an incredible opportunity. So one of the first pieces that I saw was this implant that's made by Sung Hoon Kang's lab. And the idea is that it would go into the hearts of a growing child, so that they didn't have to keep replacing the stint as the child got older. And so they're working on, based on origami structures, like an expandable structure. And I've done a lot of work with paper folding over the years, and I was so interested in how this would work. And so he was like, just sort of put the idea in my head about like things that expand and contract and hinges and whatnot. So they're still working on this in terms of like making it actually work, but it's a very, very interesting project that they're working on at Hopkins right now. And so what it made me think about was this kind of origami / kirigami called slice forms, which are also, they're collapsible geometries. So on the left, you see what happens when it's 2D and it's flat. And then if you just sort of articulate it a little bit, it turns into a 3-dimensional shape. So it can like go to flat to 3D in sort of one flick. And that was like originally like what the connection that I made visually with the work. And then they were like, well, what would happen if you 3D printed it? And they were telling me about this work that they're doing with something called bistable structures, where they're trying to make a material that has like half rigid and half flexible material properties. And so I tried to emulate that with 3D printing. So this piece here is half rigid PLA and half flexible PLA. And it makes this, either you love that sound or you hate me right now. So it's very, very interesting to play with, because it does two different, it's a ball, but it's also kind of a square. So like on one way it will roll and on another way it bounces. And so it's watching students figure that out, and kids play with it is really fun, but everybody likes to crunch it. And it's like they hate it, but they want to keep doing it, which is also very interesting. So thinking about, also about other forms that would like grow and contract. This is also a slice form, but this is a fully connected one. Instead of it being like just pieces that kind of go in like a comb, this is like a final loop. And this very beautiful Taurus form. And like thinking about just how that relates to what they're trying to make inside of the body and the heart and cycles. And when I tried to make it bigger, because this is called the Extreme Materials Institute, as Extreme Arts Residency. I was like, well, this is probably, in real life, this is about as big as my hand. So I was like, I got to make it bigger. So I tried to scale it up. And this is Mary, my studio assistant. And when we tried to scale it up, there is a point when you're making it where it just takes over and tries to make itself connect. So it just like does that as you're working, it just snaps itself into place. So that's about 3 times the size of the one that I just showed you. And then we tried to make it really big, like, 6 feet, and it just, it was a fantastic failure. I did not succeed at making it bigger. I had better chances making it much smaller, but that was difficult too. And the next person that I interacted with at Hemi was a professor named Todd Huffnagel. And I actually met him kind of by accident because I was working with another person on symmetry. And I was, he apparently is just a very good teacher. So people were like, you should just go talk to him. He's a good teacher. You'll like him. And he is a good teacher. And I did like him. And he showed me this work that he was doing. And of course, the first thing I just saw was the rainbows, and I liked it immediately. And then I was like, what are these rainbows? What do they mean? And it has to do with a kind of material science that they're studying. And what they're doing is they're taking a piece of material like titanium alloy, and they're slicing it microscopically into a bunch of different slices. And then when they do that, they're able to then see like very clearly what the outlines are. Those little different forms that you see there are called grains, and that's like represents the molecular structure of these materials. And then they reconstruct it in digital software so that they're able to manipulate it and study kind of the individual grains. And the way that what they're really the most interested in is what's called grain boundaries. So the way that those like map looking forms touch each other at those spots, that's where they can learn a lot about fracture and how a material breaks or doesn't break. And so I thought, well, this would be a perfect thing to print. I would love to play with this as a puzzle. This just looks like a puzzle to me. So this is part of that research. I just took a small part of it. And then I experimented with a process where I imprinted magnets inside of the 3D print. So you can't see the magnets, they're kind of hidden. And it's very satisfying to play with. And what was great about this for me is that it helped me, if I had to blow it sort of conceptually and physically, blow it up very big to be able to understand what they were doing at a very small level. Because of course, the last science class I took was 20 years ago. So in order for me as a layperson to be able to access their research, I had to make it really big and touchable to be able to connect with it in some way. And so this is the other part of his research, is this, they're doing it for the same reason, to look at those grain boundaries and to understand how they break and how they fit together. But it's a different process. And this is a much newer technology, and there's not very much data on this process. It's done like with synchrotrons and lasers and X-ray machines. It's crazy. And this is research from another lab. And I actually did get to talk to the people who did this research. And this is a 3D process. And so what we thought was maybe each one of those grains existed as a 3D file, and I could print it and I could build this thing. But that's not exactly how it works. So they probably, in reality, it's a very tedious process. They have maybe a quarter of the actual grains. So I wouldn't have been able to just take existing data and print it. And it's so new at Hopkins that they don't have what they call interesting data sets yet. They're just still still learning about it. So what I ended up doing was just creating an imaginary material. So I learned about this software called Dream 3D, which is a software that some material scientists use for data visualization. And so what it allows you to do is to take the base properties of several different materials, and organic and inorganic, and then you can like digitally manipulate them to see what might happen. And I don't know anything about material science really, so I was just doing it based on visuals and colors and, you know, trying to make what I call a nice loaf. So this is built on the properties of copper. So what I was wanting to do was make this into like a huge 3D puzzle, because again, it was called the Extreme Materials Art Partnership. So I had to go big or go home. And so I created it here and created all the different pieces, about 270 some pieces. And I wanted to see how I could do it. So I made some small ones first. And this one you can see, like, I kind of rounded it. I was trying to get them smooth because my modernist sensibilities told me that would be nicer than all the jagged stuff. But it didn't fit super well because I was like, you know, digitally smoothing it too much. And then I talked to some grad students and they said, well, actually all that jagged stuff, which I'm interpreting as like the same as a pixelized photo, they're like, that's actually a more accurate representation of what the grain actually is. And so that sold me. And so even though this is what we call voxelized, which is like pixelized in volume, it's super cool looking, and it adds a different challenge to the puzzle because you have to sort of map these textures together to get them to sync up together. I also increased the magnet strength so that it would be a little stronger of a click. It was more satisfying if it like really got you. And in talking to my students about it, they were like, the first one, the green one, that one looks like math. This one looks like science. So I thought that was an interesting perspective from their part. And then here's the actual final big one. It took 600 hours of printing, and each one is hand. I wanted to hide the magnets, but the polarizing, dealing with polarization with all of those like non-linear sides was just crazy difficult. So we ended up just like drilling in and gluing them in hand one at a time. Thank you to my husband and my studio assistant for all the many hours of work on this. And that was like the final puzzle, which was part of a show that we did at Hopkins for all the different professors that I worked with, because I worked with several. The show was called Symmetry and Fracture, and it was about the like what's the same and what's different about art and science, but also about being able to physically touch things that are like only looked at, you know, from a molecular standpoint. So, you know, these grains are maybe 100,000 times bigger than what they are in real life in a real piece of copper. The other part of sort of grain research that I did was with a professor named June Wicks, she does not really metal, she does more organic stuff, and she's studies rocks and all kinds of things. But these symmetries were really interesting because the molecular structure of many of these minerals ends up being like these beautiful geometric forms. So what's above her there is like the different kinds of calcite, if you know, the different molecular structures of those blown up really big. And so I made a bunch of what I call crystal lamps based on those ideas of the rocks that they were aligned with. And some of them are just like if you look at garnet, for example, the molecular structure of that and like a perfect piece of garnet, it looks almost exactly the same. It's sort of beautiful. And here's just some pictures of people playing with the pieces. And what was great is that people were really interacting with it. This was in the library, one of the libraries at Hopkins, and it's an incredibly difficult puzzle. I call it the impossible puzzle. It is, to date, has not been solved by anyone but me, but I have the map, so I'm sort of cheating. But like people were really engaged in it, and like I think because it's not something that you've ever really seen before, and it really is based on something that exists in real life that you just can't see with your eyes. But hopefully, I think it helped with connection and with our outreach. You know, that's a big part of what a lot of the scientists that I've worked with are interested in, is like, how do they get people to care about their research? And I mean that really seriously. And I think about, how do I get people to play with that idea, right? Because a lot of times, it's very intimidating, the research that these scientists and mathematicians are doing. And it's hard to know what they're talking about. But if you can make it playful and take some of the threat away, then people can really engage and ask amazing questions, which they did. And it was a very wonderful experience. So just another close up so you can see some of the metallic. I printed with a glittery filament because I love glitter, and it really was very beautiful. And then finally, that work at Hopkins led to an actual project. Not that my puzzle is not actual, it's real, it exists. It's right in the corner behind me, actually. But this is a project that I ended up helping on as what I would say is like a play-based 3D printing specialist. So Sung Hoon Kang, who did the expandable geometries with the heart implants for kids, this is a project that he was working on called Ventlock. So at the beginning of the pandemic, as you know, back in a couple of Marches ago, I'm not sure what day it is anymore, but everybody was scrambling to try to figure out how to help, and there was a beautiful time of collaboration. And so this is a piece that came out of the Hopkins research of that lab, trying to work on a ventilator splitter, because the ventilator shortages, not just in our own country, but across the world, are pretty intense. And there are, in the entire continent of Africa, 2,000 ventilators. And that's a pretty big disparity. And so the goal of this project was to try to figure out how to make something readily available and cheaply, because of course, supply chains were really challenged, and the normal engineering process and FDA approval process, so many problems with that. And so I got brought in as, this was also a time when people weren't getting into their labs. They weren't able to do anything. And I have a 3D printing lab at my house, my studio. They wanted to print with some interesting materials that are difficult, like nylon and PETG, which takes a little bit of skill. If you've never printed with those before, it's not just press play. So I got brought in as an experimenter. There's a ton of people working on this project, and I just want to make sure that I fully acknowledge that it's mostly, the work of these incredibly talented engineers and doctors and scientists. And I was very honored to be brought in as an artist, and I would say listened to as an artist. And I would say what I really did was I played with this stuff, and I came up with some interesting results that helps the project. And also, of course, my friend Brockett Horn and I helped with them with their visuals as well, because we're gonna make sure that they looked correct. Now, this is the final project. This is printed out of a biocompatible resin. This is the final Ventlock, if you will. And this is basically how it works as a splitter. And this is a diagram we helped them with. And what I wanted to show you was the part that I worked on, because of course that's what I understand the most. These are the prototypes that I printed at home of the different models that they had. They made a million different ideas. And so what I was able to help them with was, okay, if the end goal is somebody's going to print this on their printer at home, does it work? How can you work with it? And so this is maybe March or so, they were trying to test to see if the fittings worked, and they couldn't get into the lab they have machines that of course will blow air through something and they can test it, and measure all kinds of things, but they couldn't get into the labs. So we decided, my husband and I thought, well, what if we hook it up to his CPAP machine? It's the opposite of a ventilator, but it'll blow air through it and let you see if it works. So we did this test. And it totally worked. And the scientists thought that was hilarious. And it worked great. But I was also able to give them feedback that it was a little bit tricky to open and close it because the lid was hard to grasp. So in this second iteration, you'll see that they have made the top more ergonomic based on practical design feedback. And it was much easier. So way better, way better design, worked a lot better. And so, I put that in there to show that although, I think of myself as an interdisciplinary artist and educator and full-time player, it really often does lead to serious things. And it's a noble pursuit on its own to play, to learn, but also it can be the first step in a collaboration or a project or another way of thinking or solving. And, I think it's just so important to not approach every problem as though it has to be done a certain way, and to bring a sense of curiosity and skepticism and all the things that come with play, which is, you know, like curiosity and sometimes fear and sometimes excitement. But yeah, people do tend to forget that play is a real important part of how we learn and what we do and how we interact with one another. And so I try to bring it into everything that I do in my classroom. And it's the way that I'm able to seamlessly integrate what they call STEAM studies, is to just open up to experimentation. So thank you very much. That's my talk, and I'd love to open it up to discussion, questions, and see the kind of play that maybe is going on wherever you all are, or if you have any questions about any of the projects or any of the work that I've shown.
I just wanted to give you a quick comment. Jenna, this was a really great presentation. And I was really moved by your ventilator project because, as you know, we have an artist residency at the Science Center, and I've seen a lot of different residencies where artists will work with scientists, but I feel like the artist is always taking something, like learning from the scientists, and it doesn't go back and forth. So I think it's really amazing that like you developed this project and that art was an imperative part of developing this ventilator. So that's really amazing.
Thank you. I think so too. I mean, honestly, and I credit the team with how much faith they put in me, you know, or also just, I will say they all, and maybe it was just the time of collaboration and everybody just trying to solve something, but I never got the feeling that what I was contributing didn't matter, you know. And I think that first I was coming on as a technician, right, to print something that was sort of a difficult thing to print. And I happened to have, you know, if you think of 3D printing as a craft, I'm fairly adept at it, right? So I came in at first as that, but you know, we're meeting on, you know, Slack every day and talking, and I was able to give them a lot of feedback that I would call art. You know, it's that like I'm making it again, I'm trying it, and that's a lot of the engineers sort of work very similarly to the way that I work. And so we were able to really help each other iterate. You know, I would say like, you know, I was able to see like, because when I printed it, I was like certain things like, well, it seems like this lip here is an extra thing in the file. I don't think that's supposed to be there. And then that was just like immediate feedback that we could do back and forth. But I think part of it also was like, they had already met me because I had been at Hopkins doing that artist residency, and I had already proven that I could print a bunch of things. You know, they knew they could trust me in some way, fools. But that was already built up, and I think that's true of so many community projects. It's like if you don't already have that connection and trust, it's pretty hard to just come in and trust each other and make something. Like, to spend a lot of time building that trust. So I mean, I was there for like 1.5 years before they trusted me to bring me on, you know. So that matters, I think, in lots of community projects, science or otherwise.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would say that they trusted you, but you created that trust. So it seems to me as if by virtue of just your enthusiasm you brought to the work that they were doing, and kind of the ability to imagine what they were doing kind of in an artistic form, like you created that trust.
Thank you. Yeah, it was, you know, certainly built, you know, it doesn't just happen. You're absolutely right. It's like lots of things help you learn to trust each other. And, you know, I had to learn to trust them too. And I think that's, you know, I think I hear a lot from artists and designers working in interdisciplinary settings is that they maybe feel intimidated or they feel like they have imposter syndrome. And, you know, that is something I had to work on too, is that like, first, you know, I sort of showed up and there's all this really intense stuff going on and I don't understand any of it. And I'm like, have to go back to my textbooks. Like, what's the difference between an atom and a molecule? You know, can't ask them that, you know, they're going to know, you know? So, and then eventually I just, I didn't feel scared anymore. And I think you know, I think, and again, you're probably right. Like once I was able to show them, like, I understand what you're saying, you know, I understand it through a sculpture, or I understand it through an object, you know, but I do understand, you know, on some level.
Yeah, I was actually thinking during your talk, like this talk would be such an amazing inspiration for anyone who is in that type of setting to kind of like understand that your variation of thinking on a similar subject is brings so much to the conversation.
Thanks. I think so. I think that's what I would like to see with art and design partnerships, is not just bringing a designer in at the end to make the logo, which again, we did, and I love doing it. You know what I mean? Like, and it was really important to getting their work published. You know what I mean?
Right.
To like all of their, that was not incidental. But to be honest with you, we, my colleague Bracken and I, who worked on it together, the reason that we were able to make their graphics so well is because we understood it from the beginning. You know, I had to learn what their project was about as somebody who's not a scientist or a doctor. So I remembered what it was like to not understand it because it was just 5 minutes ago. So that helped me be able to build the communication materials much better, right? You know, because I think the same thing about teaching all the time. It's like, I'm the best at teaching the stuff that I really remember not understanding. And the stuff that I know really well, like color theory, is really hard for me to teach because I'm like, I don't remember not knowing it. You know, it's just something I just understand it super well. So that's always the hardest things to teach. But I think it's so important for teachers to be in positions where they're learning and they, you know, remember what it's like to not understand something. And that helps you be a better teacher, more compassionate to your students, for sure.
Well, they always talk about people learning differently, having different modes in which we learn. This seems to cross that bridge. Is there anything that you saw in your environment that you're like, oh, I want to tackle that next, or I want to get my hands on that next?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, there's so many things, you know, I think the benefit of, you know, having like a non-neurotypical brain in a setting like that is that like everything was interesting to me. There was nothing that wasn't interesting to me because I just didn't, you know, I didn't know anything was, you know, so yeah, I'm very interested like in, there's a project from Nervous System that I just saw where they're doing like, it's based on blood vessels and they're like 3D printing sugar replicas of it. And I'm like, ooh, someone let me do that. You know, like that looks amazing. Yeah, and I'm really just like also very interested in like, I think why I was interested in the grain boundary research and is that like, I'm interested in the fundamentals of things. Like I teach freshmen for the most part. I teach like common, like core classes, general ed classes. I like to know the basics of things. I'm just very interested in that. And so I think being able to make things that are like tangible about all kinds of subjects, like how do you explain them at their core, what they are, like I'm just interested in that, you know. And I love making toys, and it's like that's not going to go anywhere. Like I want to be able to make things that are, you know, educational toys, because you know the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I come from a family of teachers, so a math teacher and a science teacher actually, so you know that explains a lot.
I just first wanted to say thank you so much for this presentation. I just really enjoyed, I was just so encapsulated by all the projects you went through. And I really want to be in your class now. But I was wondering, with that video you showed of kind of the pieces like clicking into each other and it being very satisfying, and then also the piece that when it like crumpled, it made like a sound. I was wondering with these like sensory things and like the whole idea with play and art, if you ever considered like therapeutic applications of your work, and if, you know, I guess, yeah, so that's my question.
Yeah. Actually, not to call him out, but a friend of mine, a former student, Nick, is on the call. We actually did a project in a sensory room. We built a sensory room at a children's hospice, and that particular place ended up losing funding, so we weren't able to do part 2 of the project, but we were able to, like, we built a huge waterbed, and the idea was that it was for children that weren't able to do much except be on their back, but they could look at the ceiling, and you know, we had different projections on the ceiling for them to interact with, and we made some sensory blankets, and like that. So it was the beginning of that. And years ago in my career, I did work with, I was like what they used to call a shadow. I don't know what they call it now, but I was with an autistic child for like the whole day, like, helping him during class, and, you know, things like that. So I come from a little bit of that background back in the day. So I'm very interested in therapeutic things for many reasons. And also, like, I would say broadly, the idea of props, the idea that there could be a difference in a chair that makes a student be able to be more comfortable in class, or like a pair of glasses that makes something like not radiate as much, or anything that like helps with just a prop, something that helps prop you up, or and I on another level, I see this with my students a lot, where it's like they think that they're not good at something, and then I'm like, well, why don't you try this tool instead, because you grip differently, and then all of a sudden they're better at it. I'm interested in that for sure as an educator, and as just a person who also needs props.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Ooh. Older elephants playing with a toy. Check that out. Yeah, there's a group in, I think it's somewhere in Massachusetts. It might be at the art college in Massachusetts that I can't think of the name of right now. MCAD maybe, or no, or anyway, but they have a class on just making toys for elephants. So it's called Toys for Elephants. Yeah, it's amazing. They contacted me. They're like, mass art. Thank you, Nick. Yeah, I don't know why I couldn't get to that. I was like, it's the Massachusetts Art School. But they have a whole class on it. And it's really, they're wonderful animals. And it was a cool thing about that I like to plug for my students is, so at the time that the zoo approached us, they also approached 2 other schools locally in DC, but they were engineering programs with the same project. And the engineers did not produce a result at the end of the 15 weeks because they're not trained that way. They don't build in their freshman year. Like they don't make they make calculations, they learn other things, but they're not actually building. And so whereas my students, to be honest with you, if I had gotten out of the way, they probably could have made 3 different toys. You know what I mean? Like if I hadn't have reined them in, because again, that's what I love about working with artists is like, God bless us, we don't know any better, and so we'll just go for it. So yeah, it was a nice, the zookeeper said to me, she's like, I really didn't think your students were going to be able to do it, because it was like, oh, I'm just going to take a shot on an art school and see if they could maybe do it. And I'm like, it's more than taking a shot. My students are unreal. Like they're not engineers, but they'll figure it out. Like they won't stop until they figure it out. And that's what I love about working with MICA students is like that perseverance, and they're like, God, they're so talented. It's pretty wonderful to work with them. Yeah, I see the peer engineering programs I've heard that actually from, I've over the years met other engineering professors through the just connections at Hopkins, and many of them say that they wish that there was more hands-on, or they're trying to bring that in with like maker spaces and things like that, where it's like less less risk or whatever. And they really want to do that balance where they are getting more hands-on. So yeah, I have heard that from other engineering professors that that they're trying to figure out how to maybe reform a little bit of their education, I would say. That's, my take on it. I don't teach engineering though.
Well, I mean, like speaking as a past and still current engineering student, the part where I say like it's kind of changing is that like at least at my school, well, not at the campus of the school that I'm at, but at the big campus, their engineering program like in freshman year, usually freshman year, they have all the engineering majors except for computer science, which is another story in and of itself. They all take engineering design, which is kind of an entry level hands-on, but it's still pretty heavily theory based because there is some design, but it's like definitely your cookie cutter engineering stuff. But then your capstone, at least over at that campus, it's a lot of it ends up being a lot of like your big engineering firm sponsors, sponsoring I shouldn't say like the projects are like directly related to like what those companies are doing directly, but like they're like oh, like can you have students explore so and so or something else, and so you have that. But really going back to the original topic here, like I know you brought up maker spaces and such just briefly. Like we in the computing and electronics space, especially those who kind of associate with the hacker movement and such. You know, like we've always kind of understood that the art was always implied in STEM, even though we have to make it obvious now because reasons. But have you ever thought of, now that you started to build those connections up in that sort of a space, have you really thought of really just like, I guess, further cultivating, you know, like that relationship between the art side, but also like the technical side, who might not necessarily have the artistic brain fully developed yet, but who could probably, you know, help out a lot with the mechanics of electronics or computing or whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a good, I'm glad that you brought that up. Yeah, I did a project actually a couple of years ago with also with Hopkins engineers. So the freshmen in the mechanical engineering program at Hopkins and the freshmen in our like 3D program at MICA, we did a project together where they had to like come up with a project that solved a problem, you know, and so they work together on making these, you know, strange objects and things like that. But it was great to see them working together because they had totally opposite skills, and also working with the professors, like the advice that we would give was totally different. So one of the groups was trying to make like sort of like a, I don't know, like a little, like a race car kind of a thing, because they wanted to do this thing where you like drove it through a course inside. And so they were trying to figure out how to make the steering wheel do a certain thing. And Steve Mara, my partner at Hopkins, gave them like a very technical, accurate explanation of what the different mechanisms were called and whatever. And I was like, well, you should look at like the little Tykes little car and just take that apart and see how that goes. Maybe you can just take that piece out and use it, like, and it was actually the same exact thing. It's just I had no idea what it was called. And he was like, how did you know about little Tykes? I'm like, I don't know, I got a lot of nieces and nephews and I study toys, you know. But we came to the same conclusion, but just very differently. But it also, like, we really can help each other, because it's sometimes, you know, like you said, the art part is, you know, a little bit freer about thinking about a solution, right? But what's nice about working with engineers is sometimes it's really nice to know, oh, there's a name for that thing you're trying to solve with the Weeble Wobble toy called center of gravity, you know? So we're trying to figure out how to make it do this by, like, I printed out like 50 different like little egg, like Easter eggs, and we were putting quarters inside and trying to figure out when they flopped and when they didn't, you know. So it took us forever, and it turns out, oh yeah, there's a math for that. So sometimes it's nice to just know you can just look that one thing up and try it. You know, so it goes both ways. You know, sometimes you want to wander because that getting lost actually helps you, and sometimes getting lost gets you lost, you know what I mean? So it's good. And yeah, I run a makerspace at the campus that I work at called the Make Cool Stuff Lab. It's actually called the Make Cool Shit Lab. It depends on who you talk to. But that was a space, because even at our art campus, there aren't that many spaces for students to just try to make something, and especially things that are electronic and whatever, and it to be okay if they break it, you know. So we're like, it's okay if you break it, you just got to learn how to put it back together. And so that, you know, was sort of revolutionary at the time, you know, and it's been really wonderful to have that, like, grown into, now it's a huge space that's inside one of our dorms, and it's kind of a centerpiece to our curriculum. But I'm always looking for opportunities to work with engineers and mathematicians about, like, you know, I'm interested in making playful educational objects, and I'm also, like, very interested in educational outreach. So I think that's where like I can really help with somebody, is like with if you're trying to get their research understood on another level, like I think that's something I can really help with, and I also really enjoy. And I'm fairly indiscriminate because I just kind of like being in school, you know, and that's why I became a professor, so I never had to leave. And I can be interested in so many things, which initially at the beginning of my career I thought was a negative thing, and now I realize that it's just it's a really wonderful thing. You know, the thing that ties everything together is I'm interested in it. You know, so, but that can be so many things. So yeah, thank you for that question. Oh yeah, the hackathon, yes. I think we've done some stuff with that as well. Are there animals besides elephant you'd like to work with in the future? Yes. So at the zoo, they told me that the smartest animals at the zoo, well, this is according to one guy who works with them, but he says the smartest animals at the zoo are the vultures. And they apparently like are super good at solving like mazes, and so like, and puzzle, other kinds of like puzzle boxes, like the, you know, it has to be food centric, it's got to have meat involved, but like I'm very, very interested in working with vultures and making like some kind of weird meat puzzle. And I also oh, they can remember faces. Yeah, I heard they're super, super smart. I'm like very interested in what they would respond to. Like also working with an octopus, like I've also heard that they can like solve really complicated mazes and puzzles, and I would love to build a maze for an octopus. So yeah, I got meat puzzle. Yeah, that's my proposal. Who's got money? Meat puzzle. Let's get it done. Yeah, that's those are some things that I'm interested in.